recording?
You're on.
All right, so show everybody. There's 8, along with the lovely photographer, Steve Sirota, Intro to Communications. Ladies and gentlemen, history has been whitewashed. Of that, you have no doubt. If you take a look at history books, the military history of the United States is told the conquests and victories of white men. However, I'm here to tell you that this is far from the truth. Throughout this country's history, men and women of color have played a key role in the United States military. I know a speech on American military history sounds boring, but there is a great reason for you to listen up. Many of you are not traditionally white Anglo-Saxon Americans, and you may feel this country does not belong to you. However, I'm going to prove to you beyond the shadow of a doubt that your ancestors fought and died for this country. And the United States military victories belong to all Americans. From the beginning of this country in the Revolutionary War, men of color have played key roles in the wars of the United States. However, at the beginning, men of color were more likely to side against the United States than with it. The Civil War and Reconstruction changed all of this as the fight for abolishment and liberation rallied men of color in the United States military. Discrimination persisted, however, lasting even until the Second World War. When President Truman desegregated the military, the U.S. military became truly colorblind place and set the stage for high-ranking officers from non-white backgrounds, such as Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell. During the American War for Independence and the Indian Wars which came after, African Americans and Native Americans were far more likely to fight against the U.S. military rather than for it. In America, we like to think of the rebels as good guys and the redcoats as the bad guys. However, if you look at it from the perspective of African Americans, the British were the good guys. The British promised freedom to any slave who took up arms against the rebels. There is evidence that the British were planning to end slavery in the American colonies. General Washington did not accept slaves into the U.S. military. Native Americans fought too, with the British as they viewed the British far more likely to protect their land than the Americans. After the American Revolution, the new country began conquering land from the Native Americans. Oftentimes, runaway slaves and Native Americans would tear up their order to resist the U.S. Army. A perfect example is the Seminole Indian tribe of Florida. The Seminoles were a new tribe formed as Indians pushed out from other regions by whites and runaway slaves. Together they formed a fierce army that held off the United States for many years until their great chief Osceola was treacherously murdered when meeting with U.S. officials for peace talks. The first communities of color fought against the United States military, Abraham Lincoln, and the Civil War changed all of that. The American Civil War saw a dramatic shift as African Americans and Mexican Americans supported the Union against the Confederacy, which would enslave them. Interestingly, however, most Americans supported the Confederacy as they believed the Union would continue expanding and taking away Indian land. During the Civil War, American soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army and were some of the most resolute soldiers. General Grant and Sherman, the best Union commanders, relied on them extensively and frequently praised them for their efforts. After the American Civil War, Grant and Sherman, who had worked to protect the pensions and rights of Americans, would strip them of their honors. After the American Civil War, the Union Army continued to employ African Americans, most famously as the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were black cavalry soldiers, many of them veterans of the Civil War, who fought against Indians out in the Great Plains. Sad in a way that the government pitted two oppressed communities against each other. The next big leap for colored communities in the military came with the two world wars. During WW1 and WW2, black soldiers still served in all black regiments with white officers. But the need for manpower was so intense that the government could not ignore colored communities for any longer. During World War I, African American soldiers were limited to non-combat roles as the racist President Woodrow Wilson did not believe black soldiers were capable of combat roles. However, the service black soldiers gave the country as well, remembered by the liberal whites, and returning soldiers helped kickstart the civil rights movement after the war. World War II was a big break for communities of color in the military. The soldiers were desperate, and the government could not afford to keep black soldiers in non-combat roles only. The Tuskegee Airmen and all the Black Tank Battalion in George Patton's army are perfect examples of this. Okay. As an even better example is the Navajo code breakers who used their ancient language in the U.S. secret weapon as the Japanese had nobody who could speak Navajo. The sacrifices made by the communities of color during the wars gave President Truman enough support in Congress and amongst the public to desegregate the military and help pave the way for desegregation in public places such as schools. The United States may be a force of good for the world. That is certainly open to debate. However, what is certain is that the United States history is filled with war. Consider, for instance, how the military dominates American society today. No other country reveres its military such as America does. Thus, I believe passionately it is important for communities of color to realize that they have a proud role in the military history of the United States. First, they stood up against the United States when it was a tyrannical, pro-slavery force bent on oppressing them. However, since Lincoln changed the country and made it government by the people, not for the people, but of the people, there has not been a single war in which communities of color did not play a decisive impact. From the first American soldiers in the Civil War to the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code in the Second World War, it is worth remembering the sacrifices of these folks of color made to a country which did not appreciate their sacrifices. After all, what can be worse than fighting and seeing your friends die for your country and returning home to segregated lunch counters and buses? Thankfully, the country has moved beyond this. Although there is still much to do, the sacrifices of all Americans, regardless of color, throughout our military history must be understood and honored. Thank you. If you could show everybody that's still there, we still have the Hateful Eight.
We have more than that.
Nice.
And then stop.